Every week, so much happens in your own country that it's often hard to keep track of the news at home, let alone around the world. So in the next 8 minutes, I'm going to walk you through some of the week's biggest news stories, but we're moving fast. So if you want to find out more about any of the stories, then there's article recommendations in the description. This week's biggest stories include Iran's election, the rise of COVID Delta cases, and El Salvador's currency crash. Before we start though, make sure you're subscribed and ring the bell to be notified every time we release a new global news video. Thanks for your support. The first story today comes out of Iran, where the hardline leader Ebrahim Raisi has been elected as the country's new president, having won well in excess of the 50% of votes required to prevent a runoff, although turnout was significantly lower in previous years. Not only was turnout low, but also all prominent reformers were disqualified, resulting in the US saying that the country had been denied a democratic election. Prior to his election, the country's government was balanced between a centrist president and Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and conservative clerics. Now with Raisi in power, conservatives well and truly control the country, leading many to suspect that the nuclear deal is in more danger than ever, with fellow conservatives describing the original deal as a stinking corpse and as a national humiliation. So getting the deal back on track could take a miracle of statescraft. However, with a hardliner in power, many countries around the world might be keener than ever to get a deal done, in order to keep them at bay and maintain peace in the region. Also in the last week, US President Joe Biden continued his tour of Europe, continuing on from the G7 and NATO, which we discussed last week, to visit the EU and then most notably, Russian President Vladimir Putin. We already made a video explaining this interaction on the TLDR US channel, which is linked below, but both leaders said that the meeting was effective, with them agreeing to return diplomats and begin talks about cybercrime. Most importantly for the US though, the meeting allowed Biden to reset relations after his predecessor, with Putin supposedly interested in further collaboration going forward. The full explanation can be found linked below. Speaking of superpowers, this week China passed a law allowing the government to apply retaliatory sanctions on other countries. This move could see an escalation of trade wars between China and the US, as well as other countries. This also could become increasingly relevant as relations with China worsen in reaction to continued action in Hong Kong and potential action in Taiwan. On the topic of sanctions, Kim Jong-un, North Korea's dictator, blamed sanctions, COVID, and flooding for the food shortages that his country is currently facing. Floods certainly have hit the country hard, with 2020 being one of the wettest on record since 1981, with 3 typhoons reaching land in just 3 weeks, with those 3 weeks also being crucial in the harvest calendar last year. Fertilizer also played a key role, with North Korea not being self-sufficient and relying on fertilizer imports from China, imports which COVID disrupted. In fact, this reliance is so crucial that Kim Jong-un told farmers that they had to rely on other sources of fertilizer, including human excrement. Sanctions likely aren't as much to blame though, at least not directly, as food aid is exempt from current sanctions. But donations from their biggest partner, China, have fallen by more than 80% since COVID, with the UN already stating that food from donor nations has been at an insufficient level for a decade even pre-COVID, with many aid agencies unable to work with North Korea. Regardless of what's caused the issue though, it's harrowing to hear of people starving under any regime. Just over a week ago, the UK's Prime Minister Boris Johnson delayed the end of England's COVID restrictions by a month, due to a worrying rise in the Delta COVID variant. Despite first emerging in India, this variant of COVID appears to have become dominant in the UK, Portugal and Russia. Despite total Delta rates being much lower, the rest of Europe has also been concerned about its spread, with the proportion of Delta cases rising rapidly. This is all happening at the same time that alpha cases are dropping fast, which has caused some concern among European health leaders, as the Delta variant hospitalizes patients 2.2 times more often than alpha does. Britain might have delayed so-called Freedom Day, but with a relatively high vaccination rate, they have a serious advantage over other countries with rising Delta cases across Europe, where vaccination levels are generally lower. We'll just have to keep tabs on this new, more dangerous variant of COVID and how it ends up spreading around the world. But the only way to keep yourself and others safe is for you to get vaccinated, not only helping your body cope with the virus, but helping to prevent further variants from developing. Staying in Europe, the people of Switzerland voted to reject plans to place taxes on airline tickets and car fuel in a referendum held last week. These plans were part of the government's efforts to meet their climate change efforts under the Paris Climate Accord. And with the plans rejected by the people, the government will need to find new ways to tackle the ongoing climate emergency and meet their climate targets. You might remember a couple of weeks ago that El Salvador became the first country in the world to make a cryptocurrency their official currency, with a majority in their Congress voting to adopt Bitcoin within 90 days. Thus requiring businesses to accept the cryptocurrency unless they lacked the technology to do so. At the time, their president hailed this as a big step forward, and emphasized how it opened up financial services to the 70% of El Salvadorians who don't already have bank accounts. However, it was announced this week that the World Bank had rejected El Salvador's request to make Bitcoin their legal tender, saying that while the government did approach us for assistance with Bitcoin, this is not something the World Bank can support, given the environmental and transparency shortcomings. El Salvador's finance minister clarified that they've reached out to the World Bank for technical help, and it seems that they'll still be going ahead with their plans, despite this warning and remarks from the IMF highlighting significant risks posed by crypto assets. Another country having serious economic troubles is Lebanon. Since October 2019, the country's currency, the Lebanese pound, has lost more than 90% of its value, and has now hit a new low. This is very concerning for citizens of the country, who've had to cope with increasing economic instability and food shortages, with a donor conference hosted by France asking for food, fuel, medicine and spare parts rather than money. The issue could also be destabilizing for the entire region. With the currency crashing, military pay is now also under threat, which is concerning when you consider how central the military are to the country and the region, with them supported by Western powers as a counterweight against Hezbollah and others. The US has increased their military funding from $15 million a year to $120 million a year to try and counter this trend, but it's still a major concern for many. Last week we reported on anti-Olympic protests taking place in Tokyo, with many concerned that the Games might lead to a further spread of COVID, despite international supporters being barred. And these fears seem to have come to fruition, with a member of the Ugandan Olympic team testing positive this weekend, with their home nation already struggling with a COVID surge. Possibly more disconcerting is the fact that all 9 Ugandan competitors in Tokyo, including the one who tested positive, have been fully vaccinated. It's obviously possible to catch COVID-19 despite vaccinations, but it does show the potential for the Games to spread the virus despite precautions and vaccinations. Let's end with some good news though. In 2020, charitable giving rose by 5.1% in the US to a record high of $471 billion, with giving from individuals totaling $324 billion, a 2.2% increase. This clearly helps charities in the US and around the world, and is a positive sign for change. That said, the US aren't actually the most generous country in the world, at least according to many metrics. It's actually kind of hard to measure and compare. Anyway, data from Forbes shows that the most generous country, the one where people are most likely to donate to charity, is Myanmar, followed by the UK, Malta, Thailand, the Netherlands and Indonesia. If you're a little confused by some of the countries on this list, nations with higher percentages of Buddhists tend to also be disproportionately generous due to the faith's teaching. Regardless though, a boost in charitable donations is good for whatever reason, and a positive sign in a year where so many are in need. So those were some of the biggest global news stories from the last week, and if 8 minutes wasn't enough for you, then there's links to further reading in the description. If you think we missed anything, then comment below the stories you'd like to see us cover in future episodes. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel and ring the bell icon to be notified when we release future global news videos. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that is in the description.